Hello, in this point, I want us to address the project on predictive risk analysis. So this is basically another healthcare project. And what we are actually going to do, we actually have 3 clean files. They are actually clean in this case. So we do not actually have to take them through the Power Query editor. So remember, you actually take them through the Power Query editor when you actually want to clean them. But already I've actually taken you through how we can actually clean most of the files. So in this case, allow me to load directly the 4 clean files. So I'll get into the data tab there. Then in this point, we have what you call get and transform data. So I'll actually hit on from text stroke CSV like that. Then it's actually in a CSV format, so it will actually load. So it's now here. I'll actually click on the downloads. Then inside the downloads, we basically have the 4 files here. That's the patient's risk file, fact historical events, fact risk longitudinal, then finally fact model predictions. So I'll start with the first one there, which is actually the patient's risk. Then I'll hit on import like that. But remember, in this point, we are not actually going through transformation of data. So I'll actually skip that point so that you can actually load it directly. So in this point, the data is basically clean and we are going to load it directly just like that. And you will see the query somewhere there. So this is basically a query that we've actually loaded. So let's also come to this point again for the data tab so that you can actually import the next file. So hit on from text stroke CSV, then fact historical events file there, then come to this point here and hit on load. So it will actually be loaded directly there. So 450 rows loaded. So you can actually check that this one was actually the first one, then this one is basically the second one. So let's actually bring again the third one, data tab there, get and transform data group from text stroke CSV. Then in this point, you have to hit on fact risk longitudinal, hit on import, then we basically have to hit on load. So we are loading directly because it's actually clean, just like that. So we'll have another query there, which is basically fact risk longitudinal. Finally, we have our file number 4. So from text stroke CSV like that, fact model predictions, I'll hit on import. Then we'll actually check on the query there, which is basically the fact model predictions. So I'll actually load directly. There's nothing to be cleaned. So fact model predictions. So I've basically brought them here so that you can actually check if they are actually clean. So if I hit on the filter button there, clearly you can check that we do not have the nulls and the blanks. Then I scroll down there, you will actually realize that we do not actually have the nulls and the blanks. On this part, we can as well verify that there is no blank. On this point too, for recommended intervention, we can actually check that there's no blank. So we are actually assuming that all these tables are actually clean because that's what I had actually told you before, that our 4 files will actually be clean. And we have actually checked on that with the random columns there. So given that our 4 files are actually clean, what you have to do is to create a data model. So to create a data model, what you have to do is to get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there. Then we hit on manage. Then after hitting on manage, we basically have to import these 4 files into the data model. So that's it. So we have to bring those 4 files into the data model. So before we actually go into data modeling, we have to insert a new workbook. So a blank workbook like that. Then we now have to get ourselves into the Power Pivot, then hit on manage. That is, we want to create a data model. But before we actually import the same queries that we actually had there, we have to close those queries first. So close the workbook file which actually contains those queries. It will ask you, do you want to save your changes to book 1? In my case, I do not actually want to save that. So that's actually done. So we have basically closed the workbook file which actually had the 4 tables opened. Now let's actually bring the 4 files into this point here so that you can actually do data modeling. So from other sources, that is, we are importing from other sources, scroll down there to where we basically have from text file. Then I'll actually hit on next like that. I'll have to browse. So hit on browse so that you can select. Then in this point, it is actually inside my downloads. Then I'll click on the first one there, which is actually the patient's risk file. Then hit on open. Then in this part here, we have to use our first row as the column headers. Why? Because you can actually check that the first row here is actually having the column headers. So you have to check on that. So use first row as the column headers. like that. It's actually done. Then we have to hit on finish. After hitting on finish, we just have to hit on close. So it will now appear in this part here. Now this is the data. So let's also go into importing the second file. So to import the second file, the process is actually the same. Get yourself into the home tab there, get external data there. Then from other sources, because it's actually a CSV format, then it actually means that we are hitting on the text file. Then hit on next like that. Then we have to browse. So the second file is basically equivalent to fact historical events file. Hit on open there. You will actually check that row number 1 is actually having the column headers. So use first row as the column headers like that. Then I'll actually hit on finish. So click on finish, then hit on close. So the final step is actually hitting on close so that it can also be loaded on this part here. So that's actually done. Let's now bring our file number 3. So remember, all these files are actually in CSV or text format. So from other sources like that, scroll down there, then hit on text file like that. Then we actually have to hit on next. We have to browse, give the file path fact risk longitudinal. Then we hit on open like that. Then you'll realize that our first row is actually having the column headers. So use the first row as the column headers so that they can actually be promoted to be the column headers. Just like that, hit on finish. Then we finally have to hit on close. And we now have one file remaining. So we have the dim patient's risk file, the fact historical events file, and we also have this one here for the fact risk longitudinal. So we are basically having all these three as 3 different files, but now they are actually occupying the 3 different sheets. So import again from other sources like that. Then scroll down there to where we basically do have the text file. Then finally you hit on browse there. Then you have to click on fact model predictions. Then you hit on open. Then you will also realize that row number 1 is actually having the column headers. So use first row as the column headers like that. Hit on finish. Then you have to hit on close. That's everything that you actually need to have all these files imported to this point so that you can now start data modeling. So we now have the 4 files here. So you can clearly check that these files are actually in data view. So if you want to create a data model, you have to hit on diagram view. After hitting on diagram view, you will actually have the tables here. So allow me to expand so that we can't actually be using this scroll bar. So to avoid using this scroll bar, you have to expand like that. And on this part, instead of us using the scroll bar, expand like that. In this point too, instead of us using this scroll bar, make sure you actually expand just like that. So in this point, you can actually check that this is the patient's table. So obviously this one will have the patient ID being the primary key. Remember, we have the patient ID here. We also have the patient ID there, patient ID and the patient ID. So this patient ID here will actually be the primary key because that's where we have the patient's details, the age, the gender, the BMI, all other items. So this is basically the primary key when it comes to the patient's ID. So this patient ID is not the primary key. This one is not the primary key too, and this one is not the primary key. So to actually create a link or a connection, we have to drag this patient ID here towards the primary key. Just like that, a relationship will actually be created. And you can actually check that it's a 1-to-many relationship. In this point too, we can use the patient ID there. So drag it into the primary key. Remember, we are dropping from a region of many into a region of 1. So from this point of many into 1 into the primary key. So this is basically a 1-to-many relationship. In this point too, we have the patient ID. Drag it and drop into the primary key. Now a relationship will also be created, which is basically a 1-to-many relationship. So this table here is actually linked to this, and this is a 1-to-many relationship. This table still is actually linked to this, and this is basically a 1-to-many relationship. And this table is still linked to this, and it's still a 1-to-many relationship. So all the 4 tables are now linked, and this is what we now call a data model. Because the 4 tables are linked, now it qualifies to be a data model. So let's now see how we can actually use the pivot table so that we can actually come up with several analyses using this data model. In this part, I want us to use the pivot table so that you can actually do 10 key analytics. So hit on the pivot table there, which is basically inside the home tab. So click on the pivot table there, and then it will actually ask you, are you creating a pivot table in a new worksheet or in an existing worksheet? In my case, existing worksheet like that. Then this is basically A1 of sheet 1. So sheet 1, cell A1, which is okay. That's done. So in this part, I want us to obtain the total number of patients. So to obtain the total number of patients, what you are actually going to do is to hit on this down arrow, and you'll actually realize that you have the patient IDs. So these patient IDs actually represent the number of patients. So the count of this patient ID actually represents the number of patients. So drag the patient IDs into the values there. Then it's actually getting you the sum of patient IDs. But there's no way we are actually going to obtain the sum of the patient IDs. It doesn't actually make sense. So you have to obtain the count. Click on the down arrow there, hit on the value field settings, then hit on the count so that you can basically obtain the count of the patient IDs, which basically represent the count of the patients. Now, given that we actually have the count of the patient IDs, remember this is actually the total number of patients that we have received, and this actually represents the number of patients who are actually coming for the very first time, and also those who are actually coming for repeat sessions or follow-ups. After that is actually said and done for the patient IDs, which is basically the total number of patients that we actually do have, then we can as well obtain the average age of the patients. So to obtain the average age of the patients, what we basically do have is to break down this 600 based on the gender first. So I can actually drag the gender into the rows like that. Now we will be having the count of females is basically 279 and the count of males is actually 321 and the total count is actually standing at 600. Now we can basically obtain the average age based on the gender and the total number of patients. So we have to drag the age into the values there, then hit on this down arrow so that we can actually obtain the average. Hit on the value field settings, hit on the average, then hit on OK there. So the average age when it comes to the female patients in the hospital is actually equivalent to 52.25 years, and the average age when it comes to the male patients is equivalent to 54.45 years. And the general average of the age for the patients is equivalent to 53.43 years. Now we have actually broken down the total count of the patients in terms of gender. We have the count for the females and we also have the count for the males. We have as well obtained the average age based on the gender. We have the average age for the females. We basically have the average age for the males. Then we finally have the average age of the total patients. And we also have the grand total, which is actually the total count of the patients. So that's all. So this is basically what we call the total patients and average age. Remember, you can also create measures so that you can actually obtain the total count of the patients, and so that you can also obtain the count of the female patients, the count of the male patients, so that you can as well obtain the average age of the gender and the general average. It's actually very simple. So remember, all these are basically inside the dim patient's risk. Yes, that's where we have the patient's ID that you have actually used to obtain the total count here. That's the total population. And remember, that's where we also obtain the age and the gender. That's male and female. So we can come to this point here, then right click, then you hit on a new measure, or you can just get yourself into the power pivot there. We have measures. You click on measures, then you hit on new measure. You can just click on new measure there, then it will actually ask you. The table name is actually the dim patients risk table, which is actually this one here. The measure name will actually be the total patients. So total patients like that. So for the total patients, we actually expect to have 600. So to obtain the total patients, remember we have used the patient ID inside the dim patients risk table to actually obtain the total count of the patients. So we have to use the count function. So count, we are basically counting the number of patient IDs inside the dim patients risk table. We remember we actually used this patient ID here because this one is actually the primary key. So this is where we actually give the patient IDs to the patients who actually visit the hospital. So whenever we actually have a new patient, ID is actually given in this point and it's actually recorded. So we are basically counting the total number of patients using the patient ID when it comes to the dim patients risk table. So dim patients risk table there, then identify the patient ID, click on it. That is, you double click on it like that. Then you close the count function, hit enter on the keyboard. Then you close it like that. Then you have to hit on OK here. You'll actually check that we have a measure there, which is actually for the total patients, and it has actually been selected. You can actually check that it has been selected there, but allow me to actually deselect it so that we can come down here. Then we insert a different pivot table like that. Use this workbook's data model. Remember to actually select this point here. So hit on OK there. It's actually done. Now click inside the inserted pivot table there. Then expand the dim patients risk table. Then select total patients there. So the total patients is basically equivalent to 600, and that's what we actually had there. So allow me to also obtain the average of age using the measure. So to obtain the average of age using the measure, it's actually very simple again. Remember, we actually do have the age here. So I'll get into the dim patients risk table there, right click so that you can actually add a measure. So we are adding a measure into the deemed patient's risk table there, and the measure is actually the average of age, just like that. So we are using the average function. So average, like that, then you actually open. We are obtaining the average of age, and age is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table. So deem like that, so that you can obtain the column for age. It's actually the first one there. Deemed patient's risk table, the column is actually age. So you double click on it like that, then you close the average function. So the moment you actually hit OK here, you will actually get a calculation property. Why? Because already we had used average of age when it comes to the pivot table. So there's no way we'll also have a measure for the average of age. We can call this one average age. So average age, just like that. Now the moment you hit OK, it will actually run. Now for the average age, we'll be having the measure there inserted in the deemed patient's risk table. So make sure you actually click on the pivot table that we inserted, so that you can come to this point here and check on the average age. You can now check that the average age is 53.428333, the one which we actually add up there when we are using the pivot tables. Now remember, you can also obtain the count of patients who are actually females, the count of patients who are also males, and the average age of gender again, and the average age based on the gender again. So that can also be obtained by using the measures. So let's actually see how that can be obtained. So inside the Power Pivot there, we have the measures here. So you hit on the new measure. Then in this point, we are actually inserting in the deemed patient's risk table there. Then in this part, the measure name will actually be the females count, just like that. So the female patients count, I can actually call it the female patients count. Then in this point, we will basically use the calculate function and the count rows function. I hope in this point you actually have an idea of what the calculate function and the count rows function actually do. We have actually done some projects before this, and I would actually urge you to get back into those projects so that you can actually understand more about the calculate function and the count rows function. So the calculate function always brings us the idea of filtering, and the count rows function is basically used to count. So count rows like that. So we are basically counting the rows inside the deemed patients table. So I'll actually double click on this deemed patients risk table like that. So count the total number of rows inside the deemed patients risk table, where the column containing the gender is actually equivalent to females. Remember, we want to obtain the female patients count. So the column for the gender must actually be equivalent to females, and that column for gender is basically inside the deemed patients risk table. So deemed patients risk table there. Then you select on the gender, you double click on it like that. This one must be equivalent to female. So space equivalent sign, a space, opening double quotation, then female, just like that, closing double quotation. Then we can now close the calculate function. So this calculate function is actually bringing in the aspect of where. So we are counting the total number of rows inside the deemed patients risk table, where this gender column, and this gender column is actually inside the deemed patients risk table. So where this gender column, that aspect of where is actually brought in by the use of calculate function. So where this gender is actually equivalent to female, just like that, hit on OK there. And that's all. Now inside the deemed patients risk table, remember this is where we actually inserted our measure in. So we have the female patients here. So I can actually come down here. Then we have insert. Then we hit on pivot table there. Then we have to use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay in my case. So the moment I actually drag in the female patients count into the values, check what we have. The female patients count is actually equivalent to 279. Up there, it was actually 279, which is actually good. Now, I would also want us to check on the male patients count. So for the male patients count, we can also obtain data by using a measure. So let's actually get into the deemed patients risk table there. Right click on it, add measure. So in this point, we'll actually call it the male patients count, just like that. So we'll basically use the count rows function and the calculate function. So calculate, then open, then use the count rows function. So we are actually obtaining the total number of rows inside the deemed patients table. Double click on it like that, inside the deemed patients risk table there, where the column for the gender is equivalent to male, and that column for gender is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table. So deemed patient's risk table, we have the gender. So you double click on it like that. So where that column for the gender, which is basically inside the deemed patient's risk table, is equivalent to male, space, opening double quotation, then male, closing double quotation like that, then you have to close the calculate function. So calculate or obtain the total number of rows inside the deemed patient's risk table where the column for gender is actually equivalent to male. So we should basically be having an equivalent sign there. So it's equivalent to male, just like that, and it's actually done. So hit on OK there, and a measure will actually be inserted there. So you can actually click on the existing pivot table report there. Now get yourself into the deemed patient's risk table. Scroll down there. We have the male patients count. So you drag this into the values. So it will now be adjacent to the female patients count, just like that. So we have the male patients count standing at 321. What did we actually have there? 321. We can also break down this average of age based on the gender. So for the average of age, we can actually get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, hit on the measures, then hit on the new measure. Then on this part here, we'll actually call this one here the average male's age, or you can actually start with the females, the average female's age, just like that. And now we have to use the calculate function so that we can actually filter the gender column so that we can obtain the one for the females. Then we will also obtain the average function so that we can obtain the average of the age. So calculate like that, open the average of age, and this age is basically inside the deemed patient's risk table. So you double click on it like that. So we are obtaining the average of age, and the age is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table where the column for the gender is equivalent to females. And that column for the gender is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table. So deemed patient's risk table there, we have the column for gender. Double click on that like that. Space, equivalent sign, a space, opening double quotation, it must be equivalent to female. Remember, it's not actually females, it's female. Just like that, you close the double quotations, then you have to close the calculate function. So this calculate function is actually enabling us to filter. We have actually filtered this gender column based on the females. So the moment I hit on OK there, we'll actually have a measure inserted. So I'll actually come to this point again, then insert a pivot table, then tables group, hit on the pivot table, use this workbook's data model, which is actually OK. I hit on OK there. So open the deemed patient's risk table there, scroll down, we basically have the average female's age, drag it into the values. So we have 52.24731183, which is what we basically had there. So 52.24731183, that's the average age of the female patients. Now let's actually check on the average age of the male patients. So we can actually click inside one of the pivot tables there. Then we actually go into the deemed patient's risk table, right click on it so that you can basically add a measure into it. So hit on add measure there. So we are adding a measure inside the deemed patient's risk table because that's where we had actually clicked add measure, remember? So we are actually adding a measure inside the deemed patient's risk table, and the measure name is actually the average male's age, just like that. So we have to use the calculate function so that we can actually filter the gender column based on the males, and we also have to use the average function so that we can obtain the average of the age. So calculate like that, then we actually open. Now we are using the average, then we are obtaining the average of age. Age is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table. So double click on it like that, then close the average function, comma, space. So where the gender for the column is actually equivalent to the male, that gender for the column is actually inside the deemed patient's risk table. It's actually here. Double click on it, space, equivalent sign, a space, opening double quotation, male, just like that, closing double quotation. Then you have to close the calculate function. So the moment you actually hit on OK there, we will actually have a measure inserted in the deemed patient's risk table because that's basically where we had actually hit on add measure. So this is it. now you can actually check that we have the average male's age. So remember, the average female's age is actually selected. That report is actually selected. So the moment I actually come to this point here and drag the average male's age into the values there, then it will actually be on the same report with the average female's age. So the average male's age is actually 54.45482866, which is basically what we had there, the average of males. So that's all. Now, if you would want to obtain the general average, which is basically 53.42833333, then it's actually very possible still. So what you have to do is to come to this point here again for the dim patient's risk table, right click on it, hit on add measure there. Then on this part, we'll actually call this one the average. We'll actually call it the average, then underscore their age. Remember, you can't actually call it the average of age because we already have the average of age there, and we also have the average age here. So you have to give something different. In my case, it's actually the average underscore age. So in this point, remember, we are actually obtaining the average of age. And remember, age is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table, and the function to obtain the average of the age is actually the average function. So we have to use the average function like that. Then you actually open it. We are actually focusing on the dim patient's risk table because that's basically where we have the age column. Double click on it like that. Then you have to close. Remember, we are not actually filtering based on the males or based on the females. No, this is basically the general average of age. Just like that, and hit on OK there. So we will basically have a measure inserted in the dim patient's risk table, and it's actually here, the average age. So I can actually come to this point here for the average male's age so that I can actually activate that report, then get back into the dim patient's risk table there, scroll down, we have the average age here, which is basically the general average of age. Drag it down there, and basically we have the average age to be 53.42833333. That's basically what we had there. So basically, that's how you can use the pivot tables to obtain this data, and that's how you can also use the measures to obtain this data. So we have now understood that for the populations, we have 279 for the females, we have 329 for the males. Let's now check on the distribution of risk categories. So remember, for the risk categories, we actually had the high, the low, and the medium. I can actually drag the risk category into the rows so that you can actually have them. So we have the high risk, the low risk, and the medium risk patients. But now we would actually want to obtain the count of patients who are actually of high risk, the count of patients who are basically of low risk, and finally the count of patients of medium risk. So what you are going to do there is to drag this risk category into the values so that you can basically obtain the count of those risk categories. So drag the risk category into the values, and now you will obtain the count of those risk categories. So the number of patients with high risk category is actually equivalent to 114. Number of patients with low risk category is equivalent to 282. And finally, the number of patients with medium risk category is equivalent to 204. So that's all. Now you can actually check that majority of the patients are actually having the low risk. And we can as well conclude that nearly 1 in 6 patients, because 600 divided by something close to 100, 114 is actually close to 100. So 600 divided by 100 is actually 6. So nearly 1 in 6 patients is flagged as high risk. So this helps in prioritizing the resources like specialist referrals for monitoring programs. Remember, you can also obtain this distribution of risk categories by using the measures. So let me actually show you how we can obtain the count for the high risk, count for the low risk, and count for the medium risk patients. So the risk category is basically a column inside the fact model predictions. So get yourself into the fact model predictions table there, right click so that you can basically add a measure there. So the measure name is actually the high risk count. Just like that. So for the high risk count, we'll basically be counting the total number of rows inside the fact model predictions table where the risk category column is equivalent to high. So basically we are using the calculate function so that it can actually enable us to filter. Then we are also using the count rows function so that we can actually count the number of rows. So in that point, we are using the calculate function like that, calculate, then open, then count rows function. So count the number of rows in the fact model predictions table, yes, where, comma, space, where the risk category is equivalent to high, and that risk category is also inside the fact model predictions table. So fact model predictions table, scroll down there to where we basically have the risk category. It's actually here. So where the risk category is equivalent to high, so space equivalent sign a space, opening double quotations, high. Just like that, closing double quotations, then you have to close the calculate function. So we are obtaining the total number of rows inside the fact model predictions table where the risk category is equivalent to high. Just like that, the moment you actually hit on OK there, you will actually have the high risk count here. So allow me to actually come to this point and insert a pivot table like that. Click on the pivot table. So use this workbook's data model. Then I actually hit on OK there. Now expand the fact model predictions table there. Drag the high risk count into the values. Now you can actually check that for the high risk count, we actually have 114. So let's also go into obtaining the count of patients with the low risk. So get into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, hit on the measures, then new measure. Then we are basically inside the fact models predictions table like that. Then the measure name is basically equivalent to low. So low risk count like that. Then when it comes to this point here for the formula, we are going to use the calculate function so that it can enable us to filter, and we are also going to use the count rows function. So calculate like that, then open count rows like that, then open. So we are basically counting the number of rows in the fact models predictions table. You double click on it like that, you close, where the risk category is equivalent to low, and that risk category is actually inside the fact model predictions table. So scroll down there to where we basically have the risk category. It's actually here. You double click on it. So where the risk category is equivalent to low, space equivalent sign a space, opening double quotations, low, closing double quotations like that, then you close the calculate function. So this aspect of filtering is actually brought in by the use of calculate function, and counting the number of rows where the risk category is actually low is actually brought in by using the count rows function. So hit on OK there, and that's actually done. So I'll come to this same report here, then I'll get into the fact model predictions table. You can click on it to expand if it's actually collapsed. Now in this part, drag the low risk count into the values. Now you can actually check that we have a total of 282 patients, and that's basically what we actually had up there. Now let's also check on the medium risk patients. So get yourself into the Power Pivot tab there, hit on the measures, then new measure. So the table name is actually fact model predictions because that's basically where we have the risk category column. And in this part here for the measure name, we'll actually call it the medium risk count. Just like that. Now we have to use the calculate function so that you can actually filter the risk category so that we can obtain the one for the medium risk. Then we also have to use count rows so that we can actually count the number of patients having the medium risk count. So calculate like that, then open count rows function, then open the count rows function. We are basically counting the number of rows in the fact model predictions table, which is actually this one here, double click, where the risk category is equivalent to medium, and that risk category is actually inside the fact model predictions table. So scroll down there to where we have the risk category. So scroll down again. So this is basically where we have the risk category. Double click on it like that. So we are counting the total number of rows inside the fact model predictions table where the risk category. So the aspect of where is actually brought in by the use of calculate function there. So where the risk category is equivalent to medium, space equivalent sign a space, opening double quotations there, medium like that, then closing double quotations, close the calculate function, then you just have to hit on OK here. Click on this pivot table here because that's where we have our risk counts. Then get yourself into expanding the fact model predictions table. Then drag the medium risk count into the values. Just like that, and we actually have 204 patients. So we have basically concluded in this point that nearly 1 in 6 patients is flagged as high risk. So that a statistic will actually help us when it comes to prioritizing the resources like the specialist referrals for monitoring programs. So let's check on the average predicted risk probability. So we have to insert a pivot table there, then use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay in my case. So I can actually select it like that, then take it up there, and that's it. Now, for the average predicted risk probability, you will actually realize that we have the predicted risk probability as a column inside the fact model predictions table. So what you have to do is to drag it into the values, because it's actually a numerical column. After dragging it into the values, remember we actually want to have the average predicted risk probability, not the sum of predicted risk probability. So you hit on this down arrow there, click on the value field settings, click on average there. So average of predicted risk probability, then hit on OK. So clearly you can check that we have 0.393845. So let me actually get into the home tab there. Then I just have to hit on percentage. So the percentage is actually 39%. So this model actually predicts that on average, patients have a 39% likelihood of issues like hospitalization. So this is actually the predicted risk. So remember, we actually obtained this by using the pivot tables, and we can as well use the measures to actually obtain this, or we can as well break down this based on the gender. So basically, you can get yourself into the dim patients risk there, drag the gender into the rows, and now you actually have the percentage based on the gender. So for the females, there's actually a 40% likelihood of patients facing issues like hospitalization. For the males, there's actually a 39% likelihood of patients facing the issues like hospitalization. The general or the average of predicted risk probability is actually 39%. So that's it. Now, remember, we can actually obtain all this by using the measures. So what you'll actually do is to get yourself into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group. Then you actually hit on the measures there, click on the new measure. So we are actually inside the fact model predictions table. So the measure name is actually the average predicted risk probability, just like that. So the average predicted risk probability. So in this point here, we'll actually obtain the average for the whole column. Then we basically have to apply the filter so that the gender will actually be equivalent to the females. So the measure name will actually be the female average predicted risk probability, just like that. So in this point, we basically have to use the calculate function so that it can actually enable us to filter, because we have to filter the gender column, which is basically inside the dim patient risk table. This is basically where we have the gender column. So we have to filter the gender column so that we actually have the one for the females only. Then we also have to use the average function so that we can basically obtain the average for the predicted risk probability, which is basically inside the fact model predictions table. So calculate like that, then open, then we are going to use the average function, and it's basically the average of predicted risk probability, and that is actually a column inside the fact model predictions table. So scroll down there, we have the fact model predictions table, and the column is predicted risk probability. So double click on it like that. So we are actually obtaining the average of predicted risk probability, which is actually a column inside the fact model predictions table, and the gender must actually be equivalent to the females. Now remember that the gender is actually inside the dim patients risk table. So what you have to do is to type dim like that so that you can obtain the dim patients risk table, and you have to scroll down there to where we basically have the gender column. So you double click on it like that. So where the gender is basically equivalent to female. So opening double quotation female like that, closing double quotation, then you now have to close the calculate function. So we are obtaining the average of the predicted risk probability, which is actually inside the fact model predictions table, where the gender, and this gender is actually inside the dim patients risk, and that aspect of where is actually brought by the use of calculate function. So where the gender is actually equivalent to female. So the moment you hit on OK there, and we just have to insert a pivot table. So I'll actually click on this point, insert pivot table. Pivot table there, use this workbox data model, which is actually okay in my case, just like that. Then on this point here for the fact model predictions table, hit on expand, then scroll down there, we have female average predicted risk probability, drag it into the values, just like that, and we have 0.39925448. And you can get yourself into the home tab there, click on percentage. So we actually have 40% approximately, which is what we actually had there for the females. Now we can also obtain the one for the males. So let's actually see if we can obtain 39%. So for the males, we'll actually do the same thing. So get yourself into the fact model predictions table, because that's where we would actually want our measure to be inserted to. Right click, then you have to click on add measure there. So in this point, we'll actually say the male average predicted risk probability, just like that. So we have to use the calculate function so that it can actually enable us to filter. Then we'll also have to use the average function so that we can actually run the average. So calculate, then we are basically obtaining the average. Yes, and it's actually the average for the predicted risk probability, which is actually a column inside the fact model predictions table. Scroll down there, we have it here. So double click on it like that. We are obtaining the average of predicted risk probability, which is actually a column inside the fact model predictions table. Then you have to close it like that, comma, space, where that aspect of where is actually brought in by the use of calculate, where the gender is equivalent to male, and gender is actually inside the dim patient's risk table. So scroll down there to where we have the gender. It's actually here. You double click on it like that, space, equivalent sign, a space, opening double quotation, male, just like that, closing double quotations. Then you have to close the calculate function. So the moment I actually hit enter there, we'll actually have a measure inserted in the fact model predictions table. Scroll down there, we have it here, male average predicted RP, risk probability. Now I'll click on this report here so that I can now get into the fact model predictions table. Scroll down there, we have the male average predicted risk probability. So if I actually drag it into the values, it will be inserted just next to the female average predicted RP on this part here. So drag it into this point here. Now you can actually check that for the male average predicted risk probability, we have it at 39%. Now, how will we actually obtain the general or the average of predicted risk probability without actually considering the gender? So that one will actually be the general average predicted risk probability. We are not actually considering the gender. So basically, I want us to obtain this 39. So to obtain that, we have to get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group. You hit on the measures, then click on new measure. Then in this point, we are actually inserting the measure in the fact model predictions table. And the measure name is actually equivalent to general average predicted risk probability, just like that. And in this point, we are not actually using the calculate function because we are not actually filtering. We are generally obtaining the average of a column, and that column is actually inside the fact model predictions table. So average like that, then you actually open. So average of predicted risk probability, which is a column inside the fact model predictions table. So it's actually here. Double click on it like that. So average of predicted risk probability, which is basically a column inside the fact model predictions table. And you close the average function, then just hit on OK there. That's all. So it's actually done. So if you actually get into the fact model predictions table there, you will actually check that down here. We have the general average predicted risk probability. So I can actually click in the report there, then drag the general average predicted risk probability into the values, and we have 39%. So that's all. So we have actually said that this 40% here is actually the predicted risk probability. It's actually the likelihood of a female patient actually facing issues like hospitalization. This 39% is actually the likelihood of a male patient facing hospitalization. Risk by comorbidities. So in this point, we would actually want to obtain the count of patients who actually have a high risk when it comes to diabetes and also a high risk when it comes to hypertension. That's the combined risk is actually yes for both diabetes and hypertension. Have that in your mind. So if we get into the model there so that you can click on the data view, you can check that we have for diabetes, then we also have for hypertension. So some already have diabetes, others actually have hypertension, others have diabetes and hypertension. So in our case, you would actually want to obtain the number of patients who actually have both diabetes and hypertension. So in that case, we will actually be trying to understand if these two factors actually multiply the risk. So if a patient is actually having diabetes and also having hypertension, will that actually multiply the risk? So we'll actually try to understand that. So first of all, we'll have to obtain the count of patients with both diabetes and hypertension. Have in your mind that it's both. So both diabetes and hypertension. So after obtaining the count, then we can now obtain the average risk probability. So we'll basically come to this point here for the deemed patient risk table there. Right click on it so that you can basically insert a new measure. So add a measure. The measure name will actually be diabetes plus hypertension count. Just like that. So diabetes plus hypertension count. So patients with both diabetes and hypertension. So in this point, we have to use the calculate function and the count rows function. So calculate function like that, then open. So we are basically counting the rows, yes, inside the deemed patients table. So I'll actually double click on this one here. We are basically counting the number of rows inside the deemed patients table where the diabetes is equivalent to yes. So that aspect of where is actually brought in by the use of calculate function. So comma a space. So where the diabetes column is equivalent to yes, and the diabetes column is actually inside the deemed patient risk table. So deem like that patient risk table, then you actually have to identify the diabetes. Scroll down there, then we have it here. So you'd have to double click like that, space equivalent sign, a space opening double quotation, yes, just like that. So where the column for diabetes is equivalent to yes, and the column for hypertension must also be equivalent to yes. So a comma, then a space. So the column for hypertension still must be equivalent to yes. The column for hypertension is actually inside the deemed patient risk table. So deem like that. Then scroll down there to where we basically have hypertension. It's actually here. Double click on it like that. Space equivalent sign, a space opening double quotation. Then yes, closing double quotation there. Then we have to close the calculate function. So we are basically counting the number of rows inside the deemed patient risk table where the column for diabetes is equivalent to yes, and the column for hypertension must also be equivalent to yes. So the two columns must actually be equivalent to yes. That's all. And scroll down there to where we basically have our measure. This is basically the diabetes and hypertension count. So the pivot table there has actually been selected. So drag this one into the pivot table there. That's into the drag field values. So we basically have 47 patients having both diabetes and hypertension. That's it. Now I would actually want us to obtain the average predicted risk probability, given that we already have the 47 patients actually suffering from diabetes and hypertension. So what is actually the predicted risk probability for these 47 patients? So let's actually do that. So we'll also get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, hit on the measures, then add a measure. So we are actually inside the deemed patients risk table like that. Then the measure name is basically equivalent to average predicted risk probability, given that we have diabetes plus hypertension, just like that. So the average predicted risk probability for patients with diabetes and hypertension, D plus H. So we are actually using the calculate function like that, open, then opening square bracket so that you can actually select the average of predicted risk probability. You have to double click on it like that, then a comma. So we are obtaining the average of predicted risk probability where the patients have both diabetes and hypertension. In short, the column for diabetes and hypertension are both equivalent to a yes. So we also have to bring that in this point here. So remember, the column for diabetes and the column for hypertension are both inside the deemed patient risk tables. So deem like that. Then in this point here, scroll down to where we basically have diabetes. Double click on it like that. Then space, then is equivalent to a space, then opening double quotation, yes, like that, close the double quotations there, a comma again. So where the column for diabetes is equivalent to yes, and the column for hypertension must also be equivalent to yes. So hypertension is still inside the same table, deemed patient risk table there. So scroll down like that, then double click on hypertension there, space equivalent sign, a space opening double quotation, yes, closing double quotation like that. Then you basically have to close the calculate function. So we are basically obtaining the average of the predicted risk probability, given that the patients are both having diabetes and hypertension. That is, the column for diabetes and hypertension must both be equivalent to yes. So we are obtaining the average of predicted risk probability for these 47 patients who have diabetes and hypertension. That's what we are actually doing here. So hit on OK there. So get into the insert tab, pivot table, use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay in my case. I'll hit on OK. Then expand the dim patient risk table there. Scroll down. This is where we have the average of predicted risk probability for patients having both diabetes and hypertension. So drag this into the values there. So clearly you can check that for patients having both diabetes and hypertension, the risk is actually 0.35587234. Converted to percentage on tab there, then number group, hit on the percentage. So converted to percentage, that's actually that 6%. We'll actually check on the average risk probability for the patients aged 50 years and above, and the average risk probability for the patients aged less than 50 years. So it's actually very possible because we actually do have the average risk probability already. Then we also do have the age when it comes to the dim patients risk table. There we have the age column. So first of all, let's actually start with the average risk probability for the patients aged 50 and above. So right click there so that you can actually insert a measure. And it's actually inside the dim patients risk table there. And the measure name is actually equivalent to average risk probability for patients aged 50 and above. So we'll basically say calculate like that. Then we actually open it, use a square bracket there because you already have the average predicted risk probability. It's actually down here. So it's basically here, the average predicted risk probability. Double click on it like that. So if you actually want to obtain the list for the measures, you actually have to use a square bracket. So we are obtaining the average predicted risk probability for the patients who are actually aged 50 and above. So the age should actually be 50 and above, and the age is actually a column inside the dim patient risk table. So inside the dim patient risk table there, we have the age column. Double click on it like that. A space, it must be greater than or equivalent to a space 50, just like that. Then you have to close the calculate function. So we are obtaining the average of the predicted risk probability given that the age, which is basically inside the dim patient risk table, is greater than or equivalent to 50. So the moment I hit on OK there, I'll actually get on a measure inside the dim patient risk table, and it's actually here. So given that the pivot table is actually selected, I'll just drag the average risk probability into the values there. And the risk probability for the patients aged 50 and above is equivalent to 0.40174359, which is approximately 40%. So click on the value there, get yourself into the home tab. Then on this part here, you hit on the percentage. So that's basically 40%. So let's also obtain the average risk probability for the patients aged less than 50 years. So get yourself into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, hit on the measures, then hit on new measure there. So the table name is basically dim patients risk table. Then the measure is actually equivalent to average risk probability. Then in this point, we'll actually say for the patients less than 50 years, just like that. So in this part, we are also going to use the calculate function because we are going to filter the age. So calculate, then open square bracket again. So calculate the average of predicted risk probability. Double click on it like that, where the age is actually less than 50. That age is actually inside the dim patients risk table. So dim like that, then you basically have the age. Double click on the age there. So where the age, which is basically inside the dim patients risk table, is less than 50. So less than 50, just like that, and you close the calculate function. So we are calculating or obtaining the average of predicted risk probability given that the age, which is basically a column inside the dim patients risk table, is less than 50. So the age has to be less than 50. So the moment I hit on OK there, we will actually have a measure inserted on this point here, and you can actually check the average risk probability for the patients aged less than 50 years. So I can actually click on the pivot table there so that I can come to this point again and drag the average risk probability into the values so that we can now have it there at 38%. So we can actually check that the risk for the patients aged 50 and above is 40%, and the risk for the patients aged less than 50 years is 38%. So the conclusion in this point is that age actually plays a key role when it comes to the risk probabilities, because the ones actually having 50 years and above are actually having a higher risk. I want us to check on the count of historical events. So the historical events, you can actually check that you have a table there for fact historical events. So if I can actually expand it like that, you'll actually check that we have about 6 columns. That's the event ID, patient ID, event date, event type, severity, and outcomes. So in this point, I would actually want us to check on the breakdown of event types. That's the count by event types. So if we actually go into the model there, then we actually come to this point here for the historical events. You'll actually check that we have the event types. I'll click on the filter button there. So we have the diagnosis CVD, which is actually the cardiovascular diagnosis. Then we have the ER visits. We have the hospital admission. Down there, we also have readmission. So I want us to obtain the count by the event types, which is actually very simple. So what you are going to do in this point is to drag the event types into the rows like that. Then we also have to drag the event types into the values so that you can obtain the count of event types. So drag the event type into the values there. So for diagnosis CVD, we have 88 events. For ER visit, we have 108 events. For hospital admission, we have 132 events. And for readmission, we basically have 122 events. So a total count of 450 events. So you might also want to obtain this grand total here without actually having to obtain the event types, which is actually very simple because you basically have the event ID. So you have to obtain the count of event ID so that you can obtain the total events. So the total events is basically equivalent to the count of event ID. So I can actually show you that. So come to this point here, insert, then hit on the pivot table, use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay there. For the total events, we have to drag the event ID into the values so that we can now click on the down arrow there, hit on the value field settings and click on count. Then I just have to hit on OK. Remember, it's now count of event ID. So the moment I click on OK there, I will basically have 450. So the total events that you basically do have is equivalent to 450, and this is basically the breakdown of event types. So the count of hospital admission is actually the leading with 132, followed by the count of readmission, which actually is equivalent to 122. So hospital admission and readmission are actually the most frequent. So the predictive models should focus heavily on preventing this. So remember, you can also obtain these counts by using the measures in Power Pivot. So we have to get into the Power Pivot tab there. Then in this point here, we click on the measures, then we hit on the new measure there. So we are actually creating the measure inside the fact historical events table like that. You click on it like that. Then the measure name is basically equivalent to count of diagnosis CVD event type. So count of diagnosis CVD event type. Just like that. Now in this point here, remember we are going to count the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table where the column for the event type is equivalent to diagnosis CVD. So that basically means that you are going to use the calculate function and the count rows function. So calculate like that, then open count rows function like that, then open it again. So in this point, we are basically counting the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table like that. Then you actually close. So where the column for event type, that event type is basically inside the fact historical events table. So event type is basically here. You double click on it like that, space equivalent sign a space, opening double quotations. It must be equivalent to diagnosis underscore CVD. Then you have to close the quotation there, then you close the calculate function. So we are obtaining the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table where the column for the event type, and this column event type is actually inside the fact historical events table. So where the column event type is actually equivalent to diagnosis CVD. So hit on OK there, and basically we'll have a measure inserted in the fact historical events table there. So click on it like that. Then this point here, you can actually check that we have the count, but in my case, allow me to actually deselect it first. Now come to this point, hit on insert tab there, pivot table, then use this workbook's data model, click on OK, click inside the pivot table there, come to this point here for the fact historical events table where we basically do have the count of diagnosis CVD, which is basically the measure that we created at the moment. Then drag it into the events there. So we have a count of 88. And that's basically what we actually had there. So let's also obtain the count for the patients who actually visit the emergency room. So into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, click on the measures, hit on the new measure. Then on this point, we are actually creating a measure inside the fact historical events table. Then the measure name is actually equivalent to ER, then underscore visit count, or you can actually say the count of ER visit. Because you are going to use filtering and counting, then that one will actually be the calculate and count rows. So calculate the number of rows inside the fact historical events table. So inside the fact historical events table like that, where the event type is equivalent to ER visit. That event type is actually inside the fact historical events table. So fact historical events table there, we have the event type. You double click on it like that, space equivalent sign as space, opening double quotations, it must be equivalent to ER visit. So ER then underscore visit. Close the double quotations there, then you close the calculate function. So we are obtaining the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table, where the column for the event type, which is actually inside the fact historical events table, is equivalent to ER visit. So this filtering is actually supported by the use of calculate function. So hit on OK there, and remember this measure will actually be inserted in the fact historical events table. Hit on OK there, then the measure will actually be inserted. So I want us to have that count adjacent to this point here. So you have to click on this pivot table there, then come to this point here, you expand that, then you drag this count of ER visit into the values, and you have the count of ER visit to be equivalent to 1 or 8. That's basically what we had there. I want us to also obtain the count for the hospital admissions. So get into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, click on the measures, then hit on the new measure. So that measure will actually get inside the fact historical events table, and the measure name is actually the count of hospital admission. Just like that. So we have to use the calculate function for filtering and count rows function to count. So calculate like that, then open count rows. So we are basically counting the number of rows inside the fact historical events table. So double click on it like that, then you actually close, where the column for event type is equivalent to hospital admission, and that column event type is actually inside the fact historical events table. So fact historical events table, so that you can actually obtain the column for event type. It's actually here. Double click on it like that, space equivalent sign a space. This one must actually be equivalent to hospital, then underscore like that, then admission. You have to close the double quotations, then you actually close the calculate function. So we are obtaining or calculating the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table, where the event type column, which is actually inside the fact historical events table, is equivalent to hospital admission. Make sure that this hospital admission is actually inside the double quotations there. So hit on OK there, and you'll basically have a measure inserted to this point. So I'll click on this pivot table there, so that you can actually have it adjacent to count of ER visit. So drag the count of hospital admission again into the values there. Now the count of hospital admission is 132. And finally, let's also check on the count of readmission. So for the count of readmission, it's actually our last one here. Get yourself into the Power Pivot tab there, or just come to this point here, then you have to right click, then you hit on add measure. So we are adding a measure inside the fact historical events table there, and the measure name is actually equivalent to count of readmission. Just like that. And in this part, we have to use the calculate and the count rows function. So calculate like that, then count rows function. So we are basically counting the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table like that. You have to close the count rows function, then comma, then a space, where the column for event type is actually equivalent to readmission. And this event type is actually a column inside the fact historical events table there. We have the event type here. Double click on it like that, space equivalent sign, a space, opening double quotation. This one must be equivalent to readmission. Just like that, you close the double quotations, then you also have to close the calculate function. So calculate or obtain the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table, where the event type, which is basically a column inside the fact historical events table, is equivalent to readmission. So close the calculate function, hit OK on this part here. So we'll actually insert it to be adjacent to count of hospital admissions. So I'll just click on that pivot table there, then expand the fact historical events table there, then drag the count of readmission into the values. So we have the count of readmission to be equivalent to 122. So remember, you can always have these ones as the percentages of the grand total. So what we can actually do, instead of us actually obtaining it as a percentage of the grand total, we can just have the count of event type again into the values like that, so that we can now change this count of event type as percentage of the grand total. Because if we actually change this as the percentage of the grand total here, then these numbers will actually disappear and we'll be having the percentages instead. But in my case, I want to keep these values here so that we can just have the percentages next to it. That's actually to the right. So what we'll actually do is to come into this second one here, which is the count of event type 2. Click on the down arrow there, value field settings, then show value as, then come to this point here, click on the down arrow, percentage of the grand total, then you hit on OK. In this part, we have 19.56%, 24%, 29.33%, then 27.11%. So we basically concluded in this point here that the hospital admissions and the readmissions are actually the most frequent, because they basically have 29.33 and 27.11% respectively. So the predictive models should actually focus heavily on preventing this, on the outcome analysis for the past events. So inside the data model there, we'll actually check that we do have a column for the outcome when it comes to the fact historical events table there, or this sheet here. So if I click on the filter button there, you would actually check that we have deceased, improved, readmitted, and recovered. So I want us to check on the breakdown, how many of them recovered, how many improved, how many were readmitted, and finally how many actually are the deceased. So it's very simple to actually do that. In this point, I'll actually use a pivot table first. So insert tab there, tables group, pivot table like that. Use this workbook's data model. Now on this point, I'll hit on the fact historical events table because that's where we have the outcome. I'll drag the outcome into the rows there. And now we have deceased, improved, readmitted, and recovered. So we can also obtain the count for these outcomes. So to obtain the count of the outcomes, we have to drag the outcome into the values. So now for the deceased, we have 20 of them, improved 127, readmitted 66 cases, recovered 237 cases. So the total is actually equivalent to 450. Now I want to obtain this one too as a percentage. So what you have to do is to drag the same outcome into the values so that you can actually obtain the count of outcome. Now we are going to convert this as a percentage of grand total. So come to this point here for count of outcome 2. Click on the down button there, value field settings. On this point, we hit show value as. Then in this point, for no calculation, we have to check on percentage of grand total. So it will be 20 of 450 converted to percentage, 127 of 450 converted to percentage, 66 of 450 converted to percentage, and finally 237 of 450 converted to percentage. So hit on OK there. So these ones are basically the percentages. Select on all of them like that. Get yourself into the home tab. Then you have to reduce the decimal places there. So we have 4%, 28%, 15% for readmitted, and 53% for recovered. So we can check that majority of the patients here are the ones who actually recovered and also the ones who actually improved. Recovery rate and improvement rate is basically high, so the readmission and disease rates are lower because it's actually disease rate is actually 4%, and you can also check that readmission rate is 15%. So this actually means that there's a good baseline care quality, but reducing the readmissions, which is basically equivalent to 15% of the outcomes, is a high return on investment target for predictive interventions. So this is basically how you can obtain that by using the pivot tables. Now, I would also want us to see how we can obtain this rate, not the count. I want us to see how we can obtain these rates here by using the measures. So remember, we have actually checked on a couple of ways in which we can actually use the measures to obtain the count. But in this case, we are actually using it to obtain the rates. So as usual, we have to get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, click on the measures, then add measure. That's a new measure. So the measure will actually be inserted in the fact history events table. That's where we have the outcomes column. So in this point, we'll actually say the deceased rate like that. There's something that you should actually understand in this point here. The rate actually means we are dividing the count by the total outcomes. So the count of the patients who are actually deceased divided by the total count of outcomes. So total count of the deceased divided by the total count of the outcomes. When it comes to the improvement rate, total count of the improved divided by the total count of the outcomes. When it comes to the readmitted, total count of the readmitted patients divided by the total count of the outcomes. In this point here, for the recovered, it will be the count of the patients who recovered divided by the total count of the patients. So that actually means that in this point, we'll be using the divide function to do the division. We will also be using the calculate function so that we can apply the filter. How? Because when it comes to the outcome column, we'll actually be specifying that in the outcome column, we are dealing with the count of the deceased, count of the improved, count of the readmitted, count of the recovered. Then we'll also be using the count rows function so that we can actually count. So we have the divide function, we have the calculate function, and we also do have the count rows function. So let's actually see how we can incorporate those three functions to give us these four rates that we actually want in this point here. 4% for the deceased, 28% for the improved, 15% for the readmitted, and 53% for the recovered. So we have to use divide. So you start with a divide like that, then open, calculate, then open. You have to use count rows again. So three functions incorporated together. So we are basically counting the total number of rows inside the fact history events table. So fact history events table like that, you just double click on it. Remember the count rows function actually takes the table only, not the column. So you close it like that. So we are obtaining the total count of rows inside the fact history events table, where the column for the outcome is equivalent to deceased. So where the column for the outcome, the aspect of where is actually brought in by the use of the calculate function. So where the column for the outcome is equivalent to deceased. And remember the outcome column is actually inside the fact history events table. So fact history events table there. Then you scroll down there to where we basically have the outcome column. So in this point here, we have the outcome column. Double click on it like that. So the outcome column must be equivalent to deceased. Space, equivalent sign, space. Opening double quotation there, deceased. Just like that, closing double quotations. So that's now done for the calculate. So for the calculate function, we have to close it like that. Now a comma. So we are now getting into the divide function. You can actually check that the divide function has actually popped up. So the formula that you actually typed is actually for the numerator. That's why you can actually check that the denominator now is actually activated. So the whole of that is actually the numerator because you have actually counted the incidences of the outcome where we have the outcome to be deceased. So we now have the numerator. So the count for the deceased is now in the numerator. Now for the denominator, remember the denominator will actually take the total count of outcomes. And the total count of outcomes inside this point here is actually equivalent to the count of rows in the fact historical events table. Remember, outcome is actually a column inside the fact historical events table. So the total number of rows in the outcome column is equivalent to the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table. And to obtain the total number of rows inside the fact historical events table, we have to use the count rows function. So count rows like that. Then we have to open it, fact historical events table like that. You double click on it like that. Then you have to close. So the count of the deceased divided by the total count of outcomes. Just like that. And the alternate result can be a 0 there. So you have to close the divide function. So the moment I actually hit on OK here, we will actually have a measure inserted in the fact historical events table. So hit on OK there. That's actually done. Now let's come to this point here so that we can also insert. Now let's actually get into the insert tab there. Click on the pivot table. Use this workbox data model. Then I click on OK. For the fact historical events table, scroll down there. We basically have the deceased rate. So if I drag it into the values, we have to obtain 4%. So drag that into the values there. You can actually check that we have 0.044444 like that. Get yourself into the home tab, then number group, click on percentage, 4%. Very simple. So let's check on the rate of improvement. So you click on the Power Pivot tab there, calculations group, click on the measures, add measure. That's a new measure. In this point here, it will be improved. You can call it the improved rate. just like that. So we are also going to use the divide function, calculate function, and the count rows function. Divide function to actually divide the count of improved by the total outcomes. Calculate function to actually bring in the aspect of filtering. Count rows function to actually count the total outcomes that we actually have. So divide, then open, calculate like that, then open again, count rows function. So we are counting the total number of rows in the fact historical events table, where the column for the outcome is equivalent to improved. So where the column for the outcome, so fact historical events, scroll down there to where we have the outcome, double click on it like that, space equivalent sign, and space opening double quotation. This must be equivalent to improved, just like that, and you close. So that's now done for the calculate function. So you close the calculate function like that, a comma, then a space. So we are now dividing that count of improved by the total outcomes, and the total outcomes in the outcome column is basically equivalent to the total rows that we have in the fact historical events table. So we use the count rows function there, then fact historical events table, double click on it like that, then you have to close the count rows function, then the alternate result as 0 there, then just close the divide function. So the moment I hit on OK in this point here, we'll actually have a measure inserted in the fact historical events table there. Scroll down and you can actually check that we have the improved rate. So check that this pivot table has actually been selected. So the moment I actually drag this improved rate into the values, we'll actually have the rate there, which is equivalent to 28%. That's what we actually had there. So let's also obtain the readmitted rate. So scroll up there so that we can actually obtain the fact historical events table. Right click on it, then add measure. So in this point, we'll call it the readmitted rate, just like that. And we'll also use the divide function, calculate function, and the count rows function. So divide like that, then open, then calculate, then open again, then count rows function. Fact historical events table. So we are counting the number of rows in the fact historical events table where the column for outcome is equivalent to readmitted, and that column for outcome is inside the fact historical events table. So fact historical events table, scroll down there to where we have the column for outcome, double click on it like that, space equivalent sign, a space opening double quotation, readmitted, closing double quotations like that. Then you actually have to close the calculate function, comma, a space. So we are basically dividing that count by the total outcomes, and to obtain the total outcomes, we basically have to obtain the total rows inside the fact historical events table. So to obtain the total rows, we have to use the count rows function like that, then open fact historical events table, double click on it like that, then you have to close the count rows function. Then for the alternate result, can be a 0 there, so close the divide function, then hit OK here. So we will also have a new measure inserted in the fact historical events table. So check that I have actually selected the pivot table there. So the moment I actually drag this readmitted rate into the values, we'll have it adjacent to the improvement rate, which is 15%, and that's basically what we had there. And finally, we can also obtain the recovery rate, which is 53%. So get up there again inside the fact historical events table, right click so that you can click on the add measure, or just get into the power pivot tab there, click on the measures, then click on new measure. It's actually the same thing. So add measure. So measure name is actually recovery rate, like that. Then we will actually use the divide function again, open. We also use the calculate like that, then open. We are also going to use the count rows function. So we are counting the total number of rows in the fact historical events table like that. Then where the column for outcome is equivalent to recovered, and that column for outcome is basically inside the fact historical events table. Scroll down there, it's basically here. So you double click on it like that, space equivalent sign, a space opening double quotation, we call it recovered, just like that. And you have to close the double quotation, then you close the calculate function because it's now done. We have actually done the filtering where the outcome is equivalent to recovered. So that's actually done for the filtering. Now I want us to obtain the denominator, because this is basically the numerator. So for the denominator, we'll actually say divided by the total outcomes, and the total outcomes is basically equivalent to the total rows that we have inside the fact historical events table. So count rows function like that, then fact historical events table, double click on it like that, you close the count rows function, then the alternate result can be a 0, close the divide function, then you just have to hit on OK here. So we expect to have a value equivalent to 53%. So you can actually check that the pivot table is actually selected there. So if I drag this recovery rate into the values there, we will actually obtain 53%. It's actually here, 53%. So that's all. So you can actually check that it's working when you use the pivot table, and you can as well use the measures. I want us to check on the longitudinal blood pressure control. So you actually realize that we had a column for the blood pressure. So I can actually show you that. So let's actually get into the data model, and it's actually here. So you can check that for the blood pressure, we have the blood pressure systolic, and these ones are actually the values. So you can check that it actually moves all the way up to the last item down there on, I think the last item is actually on row number 720. So I would actually want us to obtain the average of that blood pressure. That's the systolic blood pressure. So it's actually very simple. And remember, this one is actually inside the fact risk longitudinal table. So we have to get ourselves into the fact risk longitudinal table like that. Right click on it so that you can actually hit on add measure. Then in this point, the measure name will actually be equivalent to the average blood pressure, or average longitudinal blood pressure, which is actually okay, or average blood pressure systolic. So that can actually be descriptive like that. Then in this part here, there is nothing that you are actually filtering. So we just have to use the average function because you are running through the whole column. So average function like that, then operand. So we are inside the fact risk longitudinal table, and the column name is actually blood pressure systolic. So fact risk longitudinal table like that. So scroll down there to where we basically have the blood pressure systolic, and it's actually here. Fact risk longitudinal table like that, blood pressure systolic. So double click on it like that. Then you have to close the average function. Then hit on OK here. Then a measure will actually be inserted there. So scroll down there, and you can actually check that you have a new measure. When you actually see FX, it's actually a measure. So we can actually drag that into the values because already we have a pivot table here inserted on A1. So just click inside the pivot table like that. Then you have to drag this average blood pressure systolic. That's actually a measure that we created into the values there. And you can actually realize that our average blood pressure systolic is 141.6736111. So in this point, it will also be very important if you actually try to identify the number of patients whose blood pressure is actually uncontrolled. We'll actually say that the blood pressure level, which is actually above 140, will be termed as uncontrolled. So if it's 140 plus, then it will be uncontrolled. So what we have to do is to obtain the count of the blood pressure systolic, which is actually above 140, so that we can now obtain the percentage. And how will we obtain the percentage? We'll say the count of the blood pressure, which is actually greater than 140, divided by the total count of the blood pressure in systolic. That's the total count that you actually do have in that column. Then you convert that into percentage. So we have to get ourselves into the Power Pivot tab there, then hit on the measures, then hit on the new measure there. So in this point, we'll actually say uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage, just like that. So what you are going to do is to use the divide function, because we will actually say the count of the blood pressure, which is actually greater than 140, divided by the total count of blood pressure in that blood pressure systolic column. So we basically have to use the divide function, and we also do have to use the calculate function. Why? Because we'll actually be running the filtering. How? Because we'll actually have to say, in that column for the blood pressure systolic, we are just counting the ones which are actually greater than 140. So that's where the filtering actually comes in. And the other function is actually the count rows function. So when it comes to counting, then we'll actually be using the count rows function. So we have actually said the divide function, the calculate function, and also the count rows function. So let's actually go divide like that. You have to start with the divide function. Then you also have to insert the calculate function like that. Then we now have to insert the count rows function. So in this part, we are actually counting the number of rows in the fact risk longitudinal table. So scroll down there, it's actually here. Fact risk longitudinal table. Double click on it like that. Then you basically have to close the table like that. Then a comma. Then in this part here, the column for the blood pressure systolic must be greater than 140. So we also have to say that the column for the blood pressure systolic has to be greater than 140. So to obtain the blood pressure systolic column, you have to type the fact, so that you can basically obtain the table name there. So scroll down there, and we basically have the fact risk longitudinal table, and it's actually here, the fact risk longitudinal table, and the column name is actually blood pressure systolic. So you double click on it like that. So the blood pressure systolic which is basically inside the fact risk longitudinal table, has to be greater than 140, just like that. So space greater than sign 140, just like that. So we are now done with the calculate function because we have basically applied our filter. So you close the calculate function like that, then comma. Now you can actually check that the divide function has been activated and it's now asking us for the denominator. So we have basically obtained the count of the blood pressure, which is actually greater than 140, now divided by the total count. And to obtain the total count of items inside that blood pressure systolic column, it actually means that we have to run the count rows function inside the fact risk longitudinal table. So we'll actually say the denominator is equivalent to count rows, then fact risk longitudinal table. So scroll down there, then it's actually here. So double click on it like that. Then you have to close the count rows function, then a comma. The alternate result can be a 0. Close the divide function like that, then just hit OK there. So in this point, you can actually check that we have uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage. So I can click on this point. You can actually say this part here. Then we can insert a pivot table. So tables group, pivot table there. Use this workbook's data model. You must actually check on this because you are basically using the existing data model on this workbook. So hit on OK there. We could have actually inserted that measure inside this point here, which is actually uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage. But we actually inserted it inside the dim patient's risk table, so we can just move it. So it's actually here. So right click, then hit on edit measure like that, then come to this point here for the table name, then just pick the fact risk longitudinal table like that, then hit on OK. That's all. So if you go down there, you'll actually realize that we have the uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage. The pivot table is selected. That's the pivot table which you actually inserted. Then you just have to drag this into the values. That's, you drag the uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage into the values, and you'll obtain 0.526388889. Get yourself into the home tab there, then hit on percentage. So the uncontrolled blood pressure in terms of percentage is equivalent to 53%. So this 53% actually represents the total number of patients who are likely to worsen without intervention. I want us to check on the recommended interventions. So this one will actually help us to understand the interventions which are actually recommended for the high risk patients. We might actually be having the high risk patients being recommended lifestyle programs. So allow me to actually show you the recommended interventions that we actually do have. We have the lifestyle programs, the medications, the monitoring, then we also do have the specialist referral. So those ones are basically the 4 recommended interventions that we basically do have. We would actually want to understand more about the interventions so that we can actually come up with an idea. Maybe the high risk patients are basically recommended the monitoring intervention. So let's actually try and see that. So what you're actually going to do is to drag the recommended interventions into the rows, which is obviously what you have actually done here. Then the next thing is for us to actually drag the count of that recommended interventions into the values. So when you actually drag a text into the values, you will actually get count automatically. But if it's actually a value, you will always get summation, sum. So for the lifestyle program, we have 152 interventions. For the medication, we actually do have 147 interventions. For monitoring, we have 154 interventions. And finally, for specialist referral, we also do have 147 interventions. But we actually want to break down this in terms of risk categories. So what you're actually going to do is to drag that risk category into the column, just like that, and it's actually done. Now you can check that for the lifestyle program, we actually add 152 interventions, but this 152 has actually been broken down in terms of high risk patients, in terms of low risk patients, and finally in terms of medium risk patients. So for the high risk patients, you can actually check that in this part, we have a total of 114 patients. So the high risk patients are actually more when it comes to the specialist referral, and they are also more when it comes to the lifestyle program. So the high risk patients are actually recommended the specialist referral intervention and the lifestyle program intervention. So they are actually recommended the 2 interventions. Actually allow me to use the Power BI here so that I can actually get you the predictive model. That's for the predictive analysis. So you can actually check that I've already loaded my tables there. I have the dim patients risk, the fact historical events, the fact model predictions, and the fact risk longitudinal. So all of them are actually loaded here. I can actually click on this point to expand so that you can check on the columns there. Click on that point again to expand. Then finally, you can also click on this point here to expand. So these ones are what we actually had when it comes to our tables. Now I would want to actually show you the table view. So this is basically what you call the table view. So I'll click on the table view like that. And this is basically what we have. Now I would want us to create a predictive model, given that we have the smoking status. We also do have the age. We also do have diabetes here. We have hypertension and the family history. So we can actually say that if the age is greater than 50, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. For the smoking status, if the smoking status is a yes, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. For the diabetes, if the diabetes condition is actually a yes, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. For the hypertension, if the hypertension is actually a yes, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. And if the family history CVD will be a yes, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. So if you sum this 2 plus this 2 will be 4, plus this 2 will be 6, plus this 2 will be 8, and finally plus this 2 will be 10. So patients with a result of 10 actually means that they have the highest risk, and patients with a result of 0 actually means that they have the lowest risk. So we can actually create that predictive model so that it can actually help us in predicting the future events. So what we'll actually do in this point is to add a column here. That's after the cholesterol level, we'll add a column for the predictive model so that you can actually have the scores there. So in this point, we'll actually get into the table tools tab there. Then we basically have the calculations group and the new column. I'll click on the new column there. Then it's actually working. Then in this point here, I'll call this one predictive model. So space equivalent sign a space. So shift enter on the keyboard so that you can actually start with the first one. So the first one will basically be the age. Then we actually get to the smoking status. Then we get to diabetes. Then we get to hypertension. Then finally family history. So for the age, we'll actually have to introduce a variable. So variable age risk. So space equivalent sign a space. And we'll actually say in this point here, if the age is actually greater than 50, then the risk will be a 2, otherwise a 0. So if, then open the age. So the age is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table. It's actually here. Age is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table. So dim like that so that you can actually get the columns. So it's actually here. Just click on it once, not twice. So if the age is greater than 50 like that, then the risk will be at 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. The reason why we are not actually having that 2 and 0 inside the quotations is because they are the numbers. So close the if function like that. Shift enter again on the keyboard. The next variable is actually the smoking status. So smoke risk. Just like that, space equivalent sign a space. So if, then you actually open. So if the smoking status is a yes, then the risk will be a 2, otherwise a 0. The smoking status is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table. So dim like that. Then down here we have the smoking status. So if the smoking status space is equivalent sign a space, then opening double quotation is equivalent to a yes, then comma, the risk will be a 2, otherwise it will be a 0. Close the if function there. Shift enter again on the keyboard. The next one is actually for diabetes. So that one will be diabetes risk. So variable is actually diabetes risk like that. Space equivalent sign a space. So if diabetes condition is actually a yes, then the risk will be a 2, otherwise it will be a 0. Diabetes is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table. So dim like that so that you can actually get the column for diabetes. It's actually here. You click on it once, not twice. Space equivalent sign a space. Opening double quotation. If it's actually equivalent to a yes, then the risk will be a 2, otherwise it will be a 0. Close the if function there. Shift enter again on the keyboard. Variable next is actually hypertension risk. So hypertension risk like that. Then a space equivalent sign a space. So if, then you open. Hypertension is actually a column inside the dim patient's risk table. So dim like that. Look for the column. It's actually here. You click on it once. Space equivalent sign a space. So if it's equivalent to a yes, then the risk will be a 2. Otherwise, it will be a 0. So close the if function like that. Shift enter again on the keyboard. The last one is actually family history CVD. So that's cardiovascular diagnosis. So variable, the last one is variable family history risk, like that. So family history risk, space equivalent sign, a space. So if, then you actually open. If the family history is actually equivalent to a yes for the cardiovascular diagnosis, then the risk will be a 2, otherwise it will be a 0. So this one is actually a column inside the deemed patients risk table. So basically we have been dealing with the deemed patients risk table. So it's actually here. Click on it once like that. Space equivalent sign, space opening double quotations, yes, closing double quotation, comma, 2 for the risk. Otherwise it's actually a 0. Otherwise means if it's equivalent to a no. Remember, we have actually said if it's a yes, it will be a 2. So if it's a no, it will be a 0. Shift enter on the keyboard. Now I want us to return. So this column here will actually be changed to predictive model. That's the name will actually be changed to predictive model. Now I want us to have the total summations for this risk. So the total summation will actually be equivalent to age risk plus smoke risk plus diabetes risk plus hypertension risk plus family history risk. So we'll actually say return. Yes, so we have now created the variables. Now we want to return the output. So return, and remember in this point for return, we don't actually use the equivalent sign. So return, then we actually say age risk, like that, space, plus smoke risk, space, plus diabetes risk, space, plus hypertension risk, space, plus the family history risk, just like that, and we have them all. So age risk, which is actually a 2, smoke risk 2, diabetes risk 2, hypertension risk 2, family history risk 2. So 2 times 5 is basically 10. So what remains is for you to hit enter on the keyboard, or just have to tick on this commit check here. So I can just tick on it like that. I'll have the column there to be predictive model, then I'll have the scores. So I can actually hit on the filter button there, then I just select for 0. Then I just select for 0. So to obtain the ones for 0, what we just have to do is to deselect 2, deselect 4, deselect 6, deselect 8. Just have to hit on OK there. Now you can actually check that we have quite a good number for the patients whose predictive model actually dictates at 0. So these ones actually have a predicted low risk. The ones who actually have a predicted risk to be equivalent to 8 are actually these ones here. So select for 8, then hit on OK, this one's here. So these patients here have the predicted risk to be too high. So that's all. Now you can actually break down these counts based on the gender. So what you can actually do is to get ourselves into the report view there. Then inside the report view, you can actually check that we have a predictive model here. When you see this summation with a column sign there, then this is basically a calculated column. Calculated column because we actually inserted it, then we actually used the if functions. So I can just click on the visualizations here to expand. Then I just have to hit on the matrix, then drag in the gender. So the matrix is actually selected. So I just click on the gender like that. I will have females and the males. Then I just have to tick on the predictive model, just like that. Now you can check that I have 1986. So what I can actually do in this point here is to obtain the average. And to obtain the average of that, you just have to come to this point here. You can check that it's the sum of predictive model. But in my case, I actually wanted to obtain the average. So the average is basically equivalent to 3.18 and 3.42. So the average predicted risk out of 10 is actually 3.18 for the females and 3.42 for the males. So there is a higher predicted risk for the males as compared to the females. I would actually want us to obtain a responsive dashboard. So we'll check on the average age by gender, which is actually the first report. The second report will be the average BMI by family history CVD, which is the cardiovascular diagnosis. We'll also check on the outcomes by event type. We'll also check on the count of outcomes by severity, the average predicted risk probability by risk category. We'll also check on the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. Then finally, we'll check on the average of weight change by activity level. So let's actually start with the first one, which is the average of age by gender. I'll drag the age into the values like that. Then I'll also drag the gender into the rows. So in this point, you can now check that I actually do have them in terms of percentage. So what you have to do is to get into the home tab there, then change that into general format, and also change this into a general format like that, and this one again for the grand totals into a general format. But in this case, I actually wanted to obtain the average of age by gender. So I have to come to this point here for the values. You click on the down arrow there, value field settings, then average, then you hit on OK there. So we basically have 52, 54, and 53. So you can check that the average age of the males is actually higher. So allow me to insert a pivot chart here. So we'll actually get into the insert tab there, recommended charts. You click on it, then column chart is actually okay, this one here. So hit on OK, and that's it. So drag it down here, and that's all. Now let's actually go into the second one. We'll actually come and do the finishing later on. For the second one, it's actually the average BMI by family history CVD. So get yourself again into the insert tab there, so that you can actually insert the next pivot table. So pivot table report, then use this workbook's data model, because we are just using the same data that we have in the workbook data model. We are not actually going into a different data model. We are just using the existing one. So hit on OK there. So it's actually the average BMI by family history. So family history into the rows like that, then the BMI into the values. So BMI like that into the values. And that's what we basically do have. So in this case here, we just have to obtain the average. So you click on it like that. That's the sum of BMI. Hit on the down arrow there, value field settings, click on the average. Then you just have to hit on OK there. So the average is actually 30.4, 30.9, and 30.5. So what you have to do again is to get ourselves into the insert tab there, recommended charts. Then in this point, we can use a bar chart. So click on a bar chart, and that's all. Then just have OK there. So this one is basically good, because you can actually check that the decimals have been used so that the difference can be seen clearly. The next one in this case is actually the outcomes by event type. So outcomes by event type. So get yourself into the insert tab there, tables group, pivot table, then hit on use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay there in my case. So outcomes by event type. So you click on the family history events, because that's basically where we have the event type. Drag the event type into the rows like that. Then get yourself into the point where we have the outcomes, which is actually here. Drag the outcome into the values, so that you can basically obtain the outcomes by event type. So allow me to actually drag this to this point here, so that you can have a space in between the two. So that's it. Now in this case, you can actually use a pie chart. So get yourself into the insert tab there, recommended charts. Then you just have to click on the pie chart. Then that's all. Then hit on OK down here. Okay, that's all. So scroll down like that. So I have this one there. Then take this to the right like that. And then again to the right. Then just have this one at the center. Just something like that. So we'll come and do some finishing later on. So what remains in this point again is for us to obtain the count of outcomes by severity. So for the severity, what you have to do again is to insert a report. So get yourself into the insert tab there, tables group, click on the pivot table, then use this workbook's data model, click on it like that. So get yourself into the fact historical events table there, drag the severity into the rows like that. Then get yourself into the fact historical events table again, drag the outcomes into the values. So for the mild severity level, we have 161 outcomes. For the moderate severity level, 144 outcomes. For the severe severity level, or this one is basically critical or severe, we have 145. So we can actually use a donut chart for that. So insert tab there, recommended charts, then click on the pie chart. So for you to actually obtain the donut chart, you have to click on the pie chart, then you click on the last item. That's basically the donut chart. So you click on the donut chart like that, then hit on OK. And this is basically what we have. So bring it down here. This is it. So just reduce like that. Now the other one is actually the average predicted risk probability by risk category. So we have to insert a pivot table there. So insert tab, tables group, click on the pivot table there. Use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay. Insert it there. So the average predicted risk probability by the risk category. Drag the risk category into the rows. So scroll down there to where we basically have the risk category, and the risk category is actually inside the fact model predictions table, drag the risk category into the rows like that. Then we actually wanted to obtain the average predicted risk probability. So predicted risk probability is still inside the fact model predictions table. So you just have to drag it into the values like that. Then you'll obtain the sum. Then hit on the down arrow there because you actually wanted to obtain the average predicted risk probability by the risk category. Hit on average there, then hit on OK. So we have these ones here. That's 0.4, 0.4, 0.3. We can just obtain these ones as the percentage. So select like that, get yourself into the home tab there, then hit on the percentage. So 40, 40, 38, 39. So we can actually obtain, that one can be a bar chart. So click on one of them, get yourself into the insert tab there, then recommended charts. Then in this point, we can just click on the column charts. Just like that, hit on OK. So drag it down like that, bring it down again. So this is it. Now the next one is also the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. So remember, for the recommended interventions, we actually add the lifestyle program. Some were actually recommended specialist referrals. Some were also recommended monitoring. So I want us to obtain the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. So get yourself into this point here for the insert tab. Then you just hit on the tables, then pivot table there. Use this workbook's data model, which is actually okay. So the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. So fact model predictions, that's where we have the recommended interventions, and we also have the confidence score. So recommended interventions into the rows like that. Then inside the same table, we have the confidence score. Drag it into the values there. Click on the down arrow there, value field settings. Then you hit on the average. So the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. Hit on OK there. And basically, that's what we add. This one is here. So select all of them like that. So this is basically what we have. So I'll actually click inside one of them like that. Get yourself into the insert tab. Then in this point, you have the recommended charts. Then we can just hit on the area chart. Then hit on OK. So scroll down there. So that's all. Now, the remaining one, which is actually one in our case, the remaining one is the average of weight change by activity level. So I'll click on that K1 there, insert a pivot table. So insert tab, tables group, pivot table, use this workbook's data model. So I just have to hit on OK. So expand the fact risk longitudinal. That's basically where we have the activity levels. Drag the activity level into the rows, and also drag the weight change into the values. So average of weight change by activity level. So hit on the average there, then you just have to hit on OK, and that's it. So this is basically what you have as our report. So I'll click on it like that. Then don't worry, we can just hit on the field list so that you can actually check on it properly. So bring back the field list like that. So I want us to use a line chart. So insert, then in this point here, recommended charts. Then we just click on a line chart like that and hit on OK. So just hit on OK there. And this is it. So what you can actually do in this point is to arrange our visuals down here. So I'll first deselect the field list like that. Then remove that chart area there. So I'll try to reduce this size like that. Then on this part, scroll up again there. You'll also realize that we add a visual there. So I have this one down there first. Click on this one, then expand this like that. And that's it. So that is basically what we have. Then on this part, you can just reduce this still like that. Then drag this to the left. Then reduce this size a bit again. Then drag this to the left again like that. And that's all. Now I want us to see if all of them are actually visible. You can check that this one is still not clearly visible. So we just have to reduce this one again. So reduce this one like that. Then bring this one here. Reduce this one again a bit. Then bring this one here. And that's okay. Now reduce that a bit. So click inside this point here for the total, backspace, so that the chart area can be big. In this point again, click on the total there, backspace, so that it can actually be removed. Now I think the upper part is actually okay. Down here, we can just squeeze this once again. So drag this one again to the left like that. Then squeeze this like that. Drag this one to the left, which is actually okay. Drag this one to the left. Bring this one again to the left, just like that. Then you just have to reduce the size, just like that. Now we still have one remaining, which is actually the average of weight change by activity level. So for that case, I think it will still be necessary for us to squeeze this a bit. You can still squeeze them like that. Have that there. Squeeze this a bit again. Then remove this total. Click on it. Backspace. Then drag this again to this point there. Click on the total there. Backspace. Then you just have to reduce the size like that. So reduce the sizes so that we can actually accommodate the average of weight change by activity level. So this is it, the average of weight change by activity level. So bring it to this part here and squeeze it to the left, just like that, and that will be okay. So I think they are now clearly visible in our case. So what you have to do still is to drag this one up here to this part, to the right like that. Then you reduce the size. Drag this one again to the right like that. Then you reduce the size. And finally drag the remaining one for the average of age by gender into the right like that. Then you just have to reduce the size. That's it. So we are actually having this space so that it can actually enable us to drag a slicer there. So that's basically how it appears. And I would also want us to reduce the width. So to reduce the width, we just have to drag it downwards like that. Click on this one again, bring it down like that. Click on this one again, bring it down. Just like that, it's actually done. For this case too, we actually do the same thing. So you drag it upwards like that. Click on this one again, drag it upwards like that. Click on this point again, you drag it upwards, and finally click on this region again. You have to drag it upwards, just like that. And I think it's actually very nice at the moment. You can just squeeze it a bit again because I want us to actually have a clean space remaining at the top. So squeeze this one again a bit. Up to that point can be okay. Squeeze this one again a bit. That's okay. Click on this point again. Squeeze it downwards. That's okay. And down here, we can do the same thing. So you click on it, then you squeeze it upwards. That's okay. Click on this one again. Squeeze it upwards. That's okay. Click on this one again. Squeeze it upwards like that. And finally, click on this one. You squeeze it upwards. They are now visible. You can check. They are now clearly visible. So what you can actually do in this point is to insert a slicer. So we are going to insert a slicer based on the outcomes. So what you can actually do is to click inside the report like that. Get yourself into the insert tab there. We basically have the filters group. Click on the slicer. Then you can now check that we have all the items here. So we were actually trying to base our slicer on the outcome, and this is it. So you will actually be given the whole table like that. Then you just have to select the column there. So in my case, we actually wanted to use the outcome. So just hit on OK there. That's done. So you have to drag this one to this point. So it's actually the reason why we were actually having a space here. Just drag it like that, then have it at the center, then drag this one upwards like that. So you will actually realize that this slicer actually controls this report alone, because if I click on improved, you can actually check that this is the only report which actually responds to the slicer. Click on desist, you can actually check that. So allow me first to arrange these reports. So drag this one to the other point, bring this one to this part like that. And for this one here, you can just have it somewhere here. Then you still have one, which is actually okay there. Now I want this slicer to actually command all these reports. So what you actually do is to click inside the slicer like that, and you will actually get what you call a slicer tab. Then get into the slicer group there, report connections. So you have to select all this so that you can connect that slicer to all those reports. You actually check that it was connected to pivot table 4 only. So select all of them like that, hit on OK. You can actually check that we have 2 reports responding to this one here. So we can also bring in another slicer based on the gender. So that one will actually be very simple. So you just have to click in this report which actually contains the gender, then get yourself into the insert tab there, then filters group, click on the slicer. Then in this point we have the gender here. You click on it, then hit on OK. So reduce the size like that, then drag it upwards like that. That's actually done. So drag it down like that. That's okay. So on this point here, I'll have it to the far left, drag it to the right, then click on this one again, drag it to the left like that. Then we just have to drag them downwards. So drag this downwards like that, click on this one and drag it downwards. And that's all. So we can just have this space closed. And that's basically our slicer. Now, if I click on the gender slicer there, you'll actually get the slicer tab. Now you have to click inside the report connections because we have not actually connected that slicer to all these other reports. So select all those reports like that. So tick on this one, tick, then hit on OK there. So that's all. So if you click on the females, the slicer is actually responding. You can check. You can even check on this point here, 44, 38, 40. Click on the males. You can also check that it has shifted to that 7. On this point, it's 17, 13, 7. If you click on the females, it goes to 10, 9, 10. So it's actually responding. And this is basically what we call our responsive dashboard. That's it. Now what remains in this case is for us to actually select all these like that. Then after selecting them, hit on Ctrl X on the keyboard. Then come to this point here for sheet 2, then hit on Ctrl V to paste, just like that. Now let's actually get back to our dashboard there. So in this point, you just have to right click, then you actually delete. Now the reason why these sizes have actually changed is because we actually expanded the sizes for the reports up there earlier on. So just bring them back like that, there's no problem. And bring this one again back. There's no problem at all with that. So scroll to the right like that, then squeeze this one like that. So that's it. Scroll downwards again. Now in this part, we have to take it to the left like that. This one, take it to the left still. Drag this one to the left like that. Then expand a bit. Then bring this one again to the left, just like that. And it's actually done. So we can actually see on this point that there is some correction to be made. So that's it. Now at the top there, we'll be having our title. So we can select the cells like that. Then get yourself into the home tab there, alignment group, click on merge and center. Then we actually call this one Predictive Risk Analysis. Then hit enter on the keyboard. You can actually check that it's not aligned centrally. So you click on it like that, home tab, then alignment group, you have this middle alignment. You click on it like that, that's actually done. Hit on the bold feature there, then hit on the font size, then we can actually have it at font number 16. That's okay. Then we actually give a fill. So for the fill, we can have something like that. You click on it. Then for the font, we can actually give the band script. So click on it like that. That's all. And now this is our report. So what remains is for us to address on the titles. So this one is basically the average of age by gender, like that. This one is the count of outcomes by event type. So outcomes by event type, like that. This one is basically the average of BMI by family history. So average of BMI by family history. This one here is basically the outcomes by severity level. So double click on it like that, then outcomes by severity level. On this point, it's actually the average of predicted risk probability by risk category. So double click, then the average predicted risk probability by risk category. So PRP is predicted risk probability. On this point, this is basically the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. So the average of confidence score by recommended interventions. Then finally we have, is it the last one? Yeah, I think it's actually the last one. On the last one there, we basically do have the average of weight change by activity level. So double click on it like that, then remove this one here. So double click on the total, the average of weight change by activity level. That's done. And what we can actually do is to remove these lines here, which are actually separating these visuals. So you can just double click on it like that, then come to this point here for the border, then say no line there, double click on this point again, then say no line, and you can now check that the lines are actually disappearing. So let's also scroll to the right there, double click on this point again like that, then say no line, double click on this point, no line, double click on this point like that, no line, double click on this point again, then say no line. So this one is actually the last one, and that's done. So everything is now okay. Now I want us to remove these lines here. So you click on those lines there, then hit on backspace. Come to this point again, you click on that line, one of the lines there, like that. Make sure the line is actually selected itself. Yes, just like that. Hit on backspace. Come to this point again, you click on that line once like that, backspace. On this point, you click on it once again like that, backspace. Then you click on this point again like that, then backspace. So this is basically what we have. And now we can just double click on these titles, select like that, then underline. Select this one again. So you double click on that one again, select, then hit on underline. Double click on this one again, select, underline. Double click on this one again, select, underline. Double click on this one again, select, underline. On this part, double click on these two again. So select this one, then underline. Then finally this one, select like that. Then you just have to underline. So for the full screen mode, you can just collapse these ribbons. So you hit on this up arrow, collapse the ribbon, or use Ctrl plus F1. So hit on it like that, and that's all. So this is a full screen view. These lines had not actually disappeared, so you just have to click on it like that, backspace. So click on the total there again, hit backspace. We have a big space remaining down there. This big space here, it's not actually utilized. So you can just click on one item like that. So to row 28 like that, that's all. Click on this one again, drag it down there like that. I think that's okay. Click on this one again, then you just have to drag it down like that. Click on this one again, then drag it downwards there. So now the wall of our space has been utilized, and now our visual is too smart. So you click on the males like that, it actually responds. Get back to the females, the whole dashboard responds. And that's all for the predictive risk analysis project.